The traffic stop lasted 11 minutes. That was all. 11 minutes on the shoulder of Route 9 on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Two cars parked nose to tail in the gravel, one set of lights flashing blue in the gray midday light. Officer Dale Pruitt had done this 1,000 times. He knew exactly how it went. He knew how to approach the window, how to ask the question, how to make the discovery seem natural, inevitable, the kind of thing that just happened when you were paying attention. He was very good at his job, the way a person gets good at something they've done without consequence for long enough that they stop thinking of it as a choice. What he did not know, what he could not have known as he walked back to his cruiser with the small plastic bag already in his hand, was that the woman behind the wheel of the silver sedan was not going to accept what came next. Not because she was angry, not because she was afraid, but because she had spent 19 years investigating exactly this kind of officer, in exactly this kind of town, and she had a recorder running in her jacket pocket before he even touched the door handle. By the time Officer Dale Pruitt returned to his cruiser, the case that would end his career, unseal 14 prior arrests, and send 3 of his supervisors before an internal affairs board had already begun. He just didn't know it yet. 7 years earlier, Dale Pruitt had been a decorated officer in a mid-sized county sheriff's department, the kind of department that made the local paper for charity drives and school visits, but never made the national news. He had been on the force for 9 years, when the thing that would eventually destroy him became routine. That was the word for it. Not a decision, not a plan. A routine. It had started with a man named Calvin Reese. Calvin was 26 years old, a warehouse worker who drove a 2009 Chevy Impala with a crack in the rear left taillight. The crack had been there since a parking lot fender bender 8 months prior. He'd been meaning to fix it. He hadn't yet. Dale Pruitt pulled him over for it on a Thursday night in February on a county road 3 miles outside of town, with no witnesses and no cameras. He ran Calvin's license. It came back clean. He spent a moment in his cruiser with the overhead light on, looking at the back of Calvin's head through the windshield. Then, he reached into the compartment below his dash. The small plastic bag went into Calvin's glove box, while Calvin's hands were on the wheel, and his eyes were fixed straight ahead as he'd been told. Pruitt found it during the subsequent search. Calvin spent 11 months in county jail before a public defender, buried under a caseload that could have filled 2 careers, managed to surface enough inconsistencies in the stop documentation to get the charge reduced. Calvin pled to a lesser count, served his time, and emerged with a record that cost him his warehouse job, his apartment, and 2 years of his life. He told anyone who would listen that the drugs weren't his. Nobody who mattered listened. Pruitt went home that Thursday night and ate dinner and watched television and went to bed. He told himself what people in his position always tell themselves. Calvin was probably guilty of something. The neighborhood. The car. The way he'd looked when Pruitt knocked on his window. That particular quality of stillness that Pruitt had learned to read as guilt, not understanding that what he was reading was the practiced composure of a young black man who had been taught since childhood that stillness could save your life in the presence of certain people. He told himself the math was right, even if the evidence wasn't entirely organic. He told himself this was how policing worked at the level where the statistics were made. He was wrong about all of it. He kept going anyway. Over the following 6 years, there were others. Not every stop. Not even close. Pruitt was careful, methodical, calculated about when and where and who. He had rules. He never did it in front of witnesses. Never on camera. Always on the county roads at night, or on quiet morning stretches where the traffic was sparse. Always black men. Always with clean records, because a clean record meant fewer questions, meant the charge looked like a first offense, meant the public defender didn't push too hard. He knew the system from the inside, and he used that knowledge the way a craftsman uses a familiar tool, efficiently, without thinking about it anymore. 14 stops over 6 years. 14 small plastic bags. 14 lives bent sideways by a man who had learned that certain lives could be bent without consequence, because the people they belonged to had no leverage against the mechanism bending them. He was careful. He was consistent. And for 6 years, he was right that there would be no consequence. In the 6th year, Marcus Webb lost his job. Marcus had been a high school science teacher for 8 years. He was 34, drove a reliable sedan, coached the junior varsity basketball team on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and had not had so much as a parking ticket in his adult life. He was pulled over by Pruitt on a Sunday morning in October, on his way to his mother's house for breakfast. By November, he had been charged with possession with intent to distribute. By January, he had been suspended from his teaching position pending resolution. By May, when the charge was eventually reduced, after Marcus spent 4 months fighting it with a private attorney his family scraped together money to pay, the damage was already done. The school board had begun termination proceedings. The basketball kids had a substitute coach. And Marcus Webb, who had done nothing, who had been sitting at a full stop at a county road intersection with his hands at 10 and 2 when Pruitt's lights came on, had lost 8 years of a career he'd spent half his life building. He didn't go quietly. Marcus Webb contacted the county civil rights office, the state attorney general's office, and every journalist he could find the contact information for. Most didn't respond. One local reporter wrote a brief story that ran on page 7. The county civil rights office sent a form letter saying the matter was under review. The Attorney General's office sent nothing, but one of the people Marcus Webb emailed, a long shot, a federal address he'd found on a government website while working through a list at 1 in the morning, was read. It was read by an analyst in a field office of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and that analyst forwarded it, with a note attached, to a senior investigator named Diane Okoye, who specialized in pattern of misconduct cases involving law enforcement officers. Diane read Marcus's email on a Thursday afternoon. She read it twice. She printed it, opened a new file, wrote one line across the top, possible pattern. Verify. She was methodical. That was the word her colleagues used when describing her, always with the specific weight of a word that means more than it says. Methodical. 19 years with the Civil Rights Division, 43 completed investigations, 31 of which had resulted in prosecutions or consent decrees. She had worked cases in 8 states. She had sat across tables from police chiefs who told her there was nothing to find, and she had found it anyway, because what she looked for was not the dramatic mistake, but the small, consistent one. The pattern that only appears when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. She was 51 years old, drove a silver sedan registered under a cover name in a county 200 miles from her home, and had learned long ago that the most productive thing she could do in the early stages of an investigation was nothing visible at all. She spent 2 months invisible. She pulled the records from Calvin Reese's case, the original stop documentation, the evidence log, the chain of custody records for the seized material. She read the public defender's notes. She read the plea agreement. She noted the gap between what Calvin had told his attorney. The drugs weren't his. He'd had nothing in the car. He'd been going to a friend's house, and what the documentation recorded with the smooth, impersonal language of a system that had already decided. Then she pulled 4 other cases from the same county, the same officer, the same pattern of stops on county roads at night with no witnesses. She spread the files across her desk in date order and looked at them for a long time. The pattern was not subtle. Once you knew where to look, all 14 stops were on county roads. All 14 occurred between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. or before 8 on weekday mornings. All 14 drivers were black men with clean records. All 14 resulted in discovery of controlled substances. The chain of custody documentation on the seized material was consistent, remarkably, suspiciously consistent, in a way that suggested not careful procedure, but a template being reused. She cross-referenced the dates, the locations, the demographic data. She requested the dashcam footage. There wasn't any. The county's dashcam program had experienced a series of equipment failures over the previous 6 years that nobody had prioritized fixing. She noted this with the careful neutrality she applied to all anomalies, setting it aside to return to later. She built a timeline. Then she got in her silver sedan and drove to the county. She drove Route 9 on a Tuesday in March, because her analysis of Pruitt's stop history showed Tuesday mornings as his highest frequency period for solo patrol. On that particular stretch of road, she drove it twice, going and coming, at the speed limit, with no traffic violations, with her registration current and her insurance card in the glove box and a digital recorder running in the inside pocket of her jacket. On her second pass, eastbound, she saw his cruiser parked in the turnout by the water tower. She watched his lights come on in her rearview mirror. Her hands did not tremble. Her breath did not catch. She pulled to the shoulder, put the car in park, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. She had done this before, in the sense that she had been pulled over before. And she had done this before in the sense that she had been on the other side of exactly this stop in the files of 14 men whose lives had been broken on this road. She knew what came next. She had read it in the documentation 100 times. She waited. Pruitt took 4 minutes in his cruiser before he approached. Standard delay, she noted, consistent with his documented pattern. Consistent with time needed to prepare. He came to the driver's window and asked for her license and registration. She gave them. He looked at the name on the license, the cover name, the registered name. Nothing that would flag in any database he had access to. He took the documents back to his cruiser. He ran the plates. Everything came back clean. She watched him in her side mirror. He sat in his cruiser for 90 seconds. She noted the time. Then he got out, and he walked back to her window, and he said he'd need her to step out of the vehicle for a routine search. She asked, calmly, whether she was under arrest. He said she was not. She asked whether she had the right to refuse consent to a search. He said she could step out of the vehicle, or he could call for a K9 unit, and they could do this the long way. His voice was practiced. Unhurried. The voice of a man who had said these exact words before and had never once been told no in a way that mattered. She said she understood, and she got out of the car and stood on the shoulder with her hands visible and her expression neutral while he reached into her vehicle. She had positioned the interior exactly as it would have been for any of the 14 men in the files. Glove box closed. Center console clear. Nothing that would give him pause. Nothing that would make him choose differently. She needed the stop to be consistent. She needed it to go exactly as it always went. He was in the vehicle for 47 seconds. She counted. When he came back out, he was holding a small plastic bag. He told her it had been in her glove box. She looked at it. She looked at him, she said. In a voice that had not changed temperature by a single degree, I'd like you to be aware that I am a federal investigator with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. That I have been recording this encounter since before you approached my vehicle, and that this stop and its outcome are consistent with a pattern of documented misconduct I have been investigating for the past 2 months. She reached into her jacket and produced her credentials. Real ones. The ones she didn't use on cover operations. She had brought them today specifically for this moment. She held them up. The recording began at 1:42 p.m. It is currently 1:53. Every word spoken during this stop is on record. Dale Pruitt looked at the credentials. He looked at the bag in his hand. He looked at the recorder she held up, its small red light still blinking. His face did something complicated and slow. The way a building does something complicated and slow in the seconds between when the foundation fails and when the walls understand what has happened. He had been careful for 6 years. He had been methodical. He had known, with the absolute confidence of a man who has operated without consequence for long enough, that consequence feels theoretical, that the system bent in his direction. He had known which roads had no cameras. He had known which supervisors did not ask questions. He had known that certain people, when they said the evidence wasn't theirs, would be disbelieved by every mechanism available to disbelieve them, and that this was not a flaw in the system but a feature of it, and that he had learned to use that feature the way you use any reliable tool. He had known all of this, with the deep settled knowing of a man who has tested a wall and found it solid. He had not known about Diane Okoye. He had not known that Marcus Webb, stocking grocery shelves at 6, and because justice had not arrived yet, had sent one email to one federal address at 1 in the morning, and that the right person had read it. He had not known that a woman would drive Route 9 twice in a silver sedan on a Tuesday in March, waiting for his lights. He had not known that the case he had been building against himself for 6 years, stop by stop, name by name, small plastic bag by small plastic bag, had been assembled into a file on a desk 200 miles away and was now complete. His hand, she noted later in her report, was trembling. She told him to step back. She called her contact at the field office. Within 40 minutes, a second vehicle arrived. Within 90 minutes, Pruitt's cruiser had been photographed, documented, and inventoried. The compartment beneath the dash, the one he'd been reaching into for 6 years, contained 4 additional bags. Consistent weight. Consistent packaging. Consistent with the evidence logged in 14 prior cases. They suspended him that afternoon. Pending investigation, they said. The investigation took 4 months. Diane Okoye was thorough in the specific way that makes cases unassailable. Not just documented, but layered, corroborated, sealed from every angle a defense attorney might find. The dashcam equipment failures, once examined by federal forensics, proved not to be failures at all. 3 of Pruitt's supervisors had known the cameras weren't recording and had not reported it. 1 had actively signed off on maintenance reports, claiming the equipment was functional. The case widened like a crack in pavement when water gets in and freezes. In September, Dale Pruitt was indicted on 14 counts of civil rights violations, 14 counts of evidence tampering, and 2 counts of conspiracy. His 3 supervisors faced separate proceedings before the department's Internal Affairs Board. The county sheriff announced a full review of every arrest Pruitt had participated in over his 9-year career. 14 cases were opened for review. 14 men who had told anyone who would listen that the evidence wasn't theirs. Men who had lost jobs and apartments and years and a clean record that had been the only thing standing between them and a system that had been designed, at least nominally, to treat them fairly. Calvin Reese's case was among the first reviewed. Marcus Webb's was the second. Marcus heard from the county attorney's office on a Wednesday morning. He was in the parking lot of a grocery store when the call came. He had taken a job stocking shelves while his legal situation dragged on, because bills did not wait for justice. The county attorney told him the charge was being vacated, that the evidence had been planted, that the county intended to make a formal apology, and that there would be discussions about restitution. Marcus sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time after the call ended. Long enough that someone knocked on his window to ask if he was all right. He told them he was. He said it twice, until it felt true. Calvin Reese got his call 2 weeks later. He was 29 years older than he'd been the first time someone had asked him to put his hands on the wheel. He cried in a way he hadn't let himself cry in years. And then he called his mother. And then he called the public defender who had spent her own time trying to help him. And then he sat down and wrote a letter he had started in his head the day he walked out of county jail with a record he hadn't earned. He addressed it to nobody and everybody. He had not expected to send it. He sent it to the local paper, which put it on the front page, which was the first time in 7 years that Calvin Reese's name had appeared in print attached to something other than a charge. Diane Okoye drove home from the county on a Friday in September, the same silver sedan, Route 9 in reverse. She drove past the turnout by the water tower where Pruitt's cruiser had sat. There was nothing there now. Just gravel and grass and the ordinary landscape of a road that had been, for 6 years, the site of something careful and calculated and wrong. She drove past it at the speed limit, both hands on the wheel, the recorder turned off. She was already reviewing the notes for the next case. Dale Pruitt was convicted in April the following year, sentenced to 9 years federal prison. At sentencing, the judge read aloud the names of all 14 men whose lives had been altered by his stops. It took 4 minutes. Pruitt sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and did not look up. Marcus Webb was rehired by his school district in the fall. The basketball team made regionals that year for the first time in a decade. He coached them through 3 overtime games and a championship match that came down to 2 points, with 30 seconds left, and a kid named Dontrell, who had been on the team for 1 week when the season started, and who, under Marcus's instruction, hit both free throws to win it. Marcus said afterward that he'd known Dontrell would make them. Said he had that quality. Said some people have a steadiness that goes all the way down that doesn't come from never being tested. That comes from being tested and standing anyway. He did not say who else he was thinking about when he said it. But the people in the room who knew his story understood. Calvin Reese used part of his restitution to fix the taillight on his car. A new car. A good one. Purchased with the rest, and drove it off the lot on a Tuesday morning and took the long way home. Just because he could.